Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper along with Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, Missouri coming off a 17-5 victory over Texas. This is Missouri's, of the Pinkel era, the first time they'd beaten Texas. That was the one team he had never beaten, which seems kind of like a big deal. I don't know if you felt like it was or not. I mean, was there any special significance to that game from Missouri's perspective?
Well, it kind of was a blah atmosphere afterwards. The reaction from, I'd say, both the fans and the team was maybe more relief than anything else. You didn't have that feeling that it was this great landmark signature win at all. And I think part of that was just the context of the season. I mean, this team needed a win over anybody at this point. They still need one more to get bowl eligible. So the opponent didn't probably matter as much. I think the Henry Josey injury kind of took away from some of the excitement of the win. And I think some of the SEC stuff kind of took away just the significance of beating Texas. Maybe if Missouri was going to stay in the Big 12 and play Texas every year, that would have been a more meaningful win because you kind of sized yourself up against, the one of the best programs in the league and maybe could move it, use it as motivation moving forward. But now that Missouri's leaving, I don't know, it was kind of just a parting shot like I think you mentioned in your column, and that's really about it.
Yeah, it's weird because, Texas has been so demonized by Missouri people as everything that's wrong with the conference and kind of the reason Missouri left. I didn't notice, either from the players or the fans, any particular more excitement over this than beating Iowa State. I don't know. It was just a little bit odd. For some reason, Missouri, it seems to be a very big deal what time a game is played, the weather. It's kind of the excitement about a game, I think, has a lot to do with, for whatever reason, the surroundings of the game more than the opponent.
Right.
Their one sellout was Iowa State.
Because it was homecoming.
Yeah. So I don't know. And the game itself was pretty blah. Texas, they were ranked, and they're still ranked, but as you watch the game, never really did it go through my mind, boy, this is a pretty good team. Their quarterbacks are so bad that once Missouri got a little bit of a lead on them, you thought, well, there's no way these guys can come back.
Yeah.
Basically, Missouri was able to shut down the running game, and then those quarterbacks, even when guys were open, those balls are nowhere near. It just seems so weird that, Texas, every year with the pick of the litter, ends up with guys that just are that bad throwing the football.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the fans. I think, 10,000 empty seats for that game. When the one game, if you're a fan that's just a casual fan's going to go to one game on the year, you look at that schedule, I would think Texas would be one of the games you'd want to go to. And just kind of strange, and it made for a day that just there wasn't a really raucous environment like you might expect going into the season. Young quarterbacks sometimes don't play well in really tough environments, and I don't think that was necessarily a very tough environment, so I guess you give more credit to Missouri's defense for making it tough on them and for those guys just not being very good passers either.
Yeah, Missouri gave up 697 yards to Baylor, which was, I think, the second worst they've ever done. Looked good against Texas, cut 450 yards off that total. This week they face a totally different offense, although one that's really been struggling. Do you think, I don't think they've turned any corner, but do you think they're suited to stop a passing offense?
Not as much as they're suited to face an offense like they did last week. When I listen and talk to coaches around the league the week they play Missouri, the first thing almost all of them always say is how physical Missouri's defense is. And that's just not this year. It's years in the past. And that kind of lends itself to the type of game that Missouri played Saturday. Their front seven is usually very physical. They tackle well against teams like Texas that just run right at them between the tackles. Missouri's not as good out on the perimeter against spread offense teams like Baylor a couple weeks ago, like Oklahoma and Oklahoma State earlier this year, like Texas Tech this week. So they just don't match up as well. And granted, not a lot of teams match up well. These teams generally put up a lot of yards on most teams they play. But last week was kind of the exception in the Big 12. Kansas State is similar to that way, but they use their quarterback to run a lot more, and Colin Klein gave Missouri some problems. But those Texas quarterbacks were basically just a sitting duck back there. That's not going to be the situation against Tech. They're going to throw the ball faster, neutralize that pass rush. They don't have a very good running game, but I still think they'll test Missouri a little bit more than Texas does, just because of the nature of what they do, spreading the ball out, throwing a lot. And I talked to Missouri's defensive coordinator Dave Steckel about that very subject, and he kind of said, with college kids, there's really not much carryover from one week to the next, especially when you're playing two drastically different styles of offenses. Certain things carry over, like just the fundamentals and their tackling and things like that, but just the fact that they played well against Texas doesn't mean at all that they're going to play well against Texas Tech, because it's apples and oranges as far as the offense goes.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, as you mentioned before, the major downside of that game was losing Henry Josey for the season with a knee injury. There are 2 remaining regular season games, and then what apparently will be a bowl game too. How much does that loss affect them as they try to win out?
Well, Kendall Lawrence and Devin Moore, they should be more than enough against these 2 defenses. They say that now, but if it's a close game, you'd always rather have the best player be Henry Josey, but they don't. But I think Kendall Lawrence will be enough. Texas Tech is 117 in the country against the rush. Kansas next week is 119, and that's out of 120 teams. So this is about as bad as it gets. Texas Tech this year,
league, too.
Yeah, Texas Tech this year, they gave up 300 rushing yards to Nevada, 239 to Kansas, 368 to Iowa State. That was the most rushing yards Iowa State's had since the big Troy Davis game against Missouri years ago. And then against the same Texas offense that Missouri just played, they gave up 439 rushing yards. So this is a pretty bad defense. They've had a lot of injuries.
He's a defensive coach.
He's a defensive guy, and whatever he's trying to do just isn't working yet. I don't think Kendall Lawrence, Devin Moore should have any trouble this week.
The issue would be the bowl game. You don't know who you're going to play there, but that's probably going to be a more competitive game. I think a big issue is going to be next year. He ruined that knee every way you could ruin it. And for a guy that kind of relies on speed and quickness, you wonder, in 8 months, is he going to be good? Is he ever going to be as good as he was?
Yeah, and that's the impossible question right now. I don't think the doctors or trainers really want to even speculate on when he would be able to come back. But it being this late in the season, it would be hard to imagine him being ready for next year. But that staff does wonders with knees, and they have before with Jeremy Maclin. So we'll see if he's ready. I would doubt it. So we'll just see how the offense transitions.
Danero Alexander will always come back from ACLs like in about 6 months or less. But this is ACL, every ACL and patellar tendons. I don't know. That seems like that would be a tall order to come back in 8 months.
Yeah, if this is probably the biggest challenge the staff has ever had as far as just getting him back and ready to play football again.
Okay, and lastly, getting close to the end of the season, who on Missouri would you consider all Big 12?
Well, I think you have to go with Henry Josey. He's going to miss 2 games, but for the bulk of the Big 12 season, he was the best running back in the Big 12. I hope voters don't punish him for missing out on these 2 games, because he was still head and shoulders the most productive back in the league.
Imagine how many yards he could have added to that total.
Yeah, and on the other hand, a lot of Big 12 running backs have been lost for the year this year earlier in the season, so it's been a weird year like that. Also on offense, Michael Egnew almost by default, because really no other tight ends in the Big 12 catch passes. He's doing more blocking this year. Missouri's not throwing the ball as much, especially to him. There are games or quarters where he kind of just is invisible, but I don't really say that's his fault. It's just the nature of the offense this year. Offensive line, I talked to the offensive coaches and try to get their take, because we don't necessarily know what's going on, what the assignments are up front. And they really like what Jason Palmgren has done this year. He's played guard, he's played center, and has graded out really well. So has Austin Webbles, who plays right guard, has started every game the last 3 years. So those are 2 guys, would probably be on my radar for voting. And then on defense, you have to look at E.J. Gaines. I think he's one of the best, if not the best, cornerbacks in the Big 12 this year. Rarely does he get beat, and he also makes a lot of plays on the ball. He's second in the country in passes defended. That's either deflections or interceptions, so he's had a great year. And then if you just look at the numbers, there's not a lot of great defensive tackles in the Big 12. There used to be just a few years ago, but Dominique Hamilton has more stops, more tackles for loss, more sacks than anybody in the league. So at the beginning of the year, we weren't mentioning him at all because he wasn't making any kind of impact plays. But if you just compare him to everyone else in the league, he's way up there.
I guess you could just pick a bunch of defensive ends.
You could, and even then, there's not a lot. He has more tackles than any defensive end in the league except one. Mm-hmm. So he's getting after the running backs and the quarterbacks. Linebacker, I think maybe second team. You look at Andrew Wilson; he's had a nice year. Luke Lambert's quietly had a good year. He's made some impact plays, and maybe second team too for Jacquez Smith. He hasn't had a lot of big games, but he's had a few clutch turnovers or takeaways. In that A&M game he did, and then last week against Texas, too.
What about Trey Barrow?
Trey Barrow, too. He's been a good punter. The only problem is in the Big 12 you have the best punter in the country. That's Quinn Sharp from Oklahoma State. He doesn't even qualify for all the national stats because he punts like 2 times a game. Mm-hmm. But when he does, he's one of the best. But, Barrow, I think, would be a second-team guy. He's done a good job. even kicking since he's come on to take on that duty.
All right. Well, we will be off next week for Thanksgiving, so our next webcast will be wrapping up the whole season after they finish their games against Texas Tech and Kansas, and looking forward to what we presume to be a bowl game.